Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
And I love the classics as much as I love mathematics. So they started to ask big questions about natural science. Does it have axioms or assumptions? Does it involve beliefs? Is science completely rational? Is rationality coextensive with science? Or does rationality extend beyond science? And I discovered that most practical scientists were critical realists. They believed that there was a truth out there. They were modest enough to say they never quite grasped it, but they were getting towards it. And so, inevitably, you start to ask the kind of question the Greeks asked, and which precipitated their inquiry throughout history. What is ultimate reality? Is it rational?
Yes.
And of course, as you know, there were two major views in the ancient world. There were the atomists, like Democritus and Leucippus, that thought ultimate reality was what we would now call mass energy, the atoms, this brilliant insight that there were atomy, things that could not be divided. And because they believed that the only two things that existed were the atoms and the void, they naturally came up with a notion of explanation that was bottom-up, that everything must be expressible and explicable in terms of mass energy. But there were others equally bright, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who thought, no, this material universe is not all that exists. There's more to it than that. There is transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so barreling up through the centuries into the contemporary academy, you've got those two diametrically opposed worldviews. And in Oxford and here, you find both of them. And that's one of the things that makes the contemporary debate very interesting indeed. Because the question we're asking tonight is, where does rationality sit in it all? Does rationality drive you to go with Leucippus and Democritus and be a materialist or a naturalist? Or does rationality sit better with theism? And I want to simply argue a case to you tonight. I mean, the title says, does rationality lead us away from God? I can't answer that for you, of course. I wouldn't insult you by attempting to answer it for you. But at least I can give you some of the evidence that weighs with me, so that perhaps it will help you to make up your own mind where you stand on this. Now, the first worldview, because we're talking about worldviews, Leucippus and Democritus, their worldview we call materialism. The opposite worldview is theism, and that will have to do for this evening. There are other notions like pantheism that come into play and are important. But in the academy today, it tends to be the conflict between those two worldviews. The first worldview I met was from my parents. It was Christian. So you say, I'm biased. Of course I am, and so are you. We're all biased. There's nobody that's unbiased. And I'm sure you've studied enough literature to realize that the old notion of science being absolutely objective has gone completely. We now realize that there's no unbiased observer. We're all biased, so let's recognize that. So the first worldview I met was Christian, as I said, from my parents, and then I arrived in Cambridge, and in my first week as a student, somebody said to me, do you believe in God? And I said, oh, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that question. You're Irish. And all you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it. Well, it's an interesting thing to say. You believe in God because you're Irish. Now, I'd love to spend a little time analysing that, but I'm going to leave it to you. Because it's interesting, because what it means is, because you can give a causal explanation, you believe in God because you're Irish, that empties it of significance, doesn't it? That's the whole point of saying things like that. You say that because you're a man, or you think that because you're a woman, but watch it. Because if what you're saying is that where there are causal links everywhere, it empties it of meaning, you will empty the universe of meaning. If you assume that the universe is connected, an explanation is connected by purely causal links back to a primeval soup or something. It is very interesting that what we call the genetic fallacy actually undermines rationality, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's get back to Cambridge. I didn't know all that at that time. I simply knew he was saying, you believe in God because you're Irish. And I took it seriously. I thought, well, perhaps he's right. My parents Christian, my grandparents, and so on. Obviously, it's Irish genetics, and that's it, full stop. So I decided to do something that I hadn't really been able to do before, and that was to get people that didn't go with my worldview, that believed the exact opposite, that had never been in church, and I've been doing it all my life. Because I'm interested in truth. And I thought, since I'm starting from a biased perspective, but I believe in rationality, I want to know why people don't believe what I believe. And of course that has been a very big motive in my life. You've heard that I try at least to speak a number of languages, and there's a reason for that. I discovered that German mathematics was important, and I got the opportunity to go to Germany, learn the language to speak it, and then that gave me the opportunity to go to the German Democratic Republic, to Poland, Hungary, and Romania during the Cold War. And to begin to see what systematic atheism did to people's education. In East Germany, I met many young people who had to get out of school at 13. Why not? Why? Because they wouldn't give allegiance to the atheistic state. I'd never faced anything like that. And it was an interesting insight, and because I've been most of my professional life a translator of Russian, it gave me the chance to go to Russia when 1989 occurred, and I went to Siberia on a two-way ticket, and got into contact with many people in the Academy of Sciences and discussing these things. That was such an eye-opener. So why I'm telling you this is very simple. I have spent my entire life facing the objections to my faith. Why is that? Because I want to be certain. I'm biased. I started biased. And so I wanted to know and befriend people that did not share my worldview. And that ended up, of course, in me having the immense privilege of debating people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, and so on in recent days in your country. And I've just been on the Charlie Rose show for an hour with Richard Dawkins again, just a couple of weeks ago. When they'll air that, I don't know, but I think you've got some sort of election coming up that might delay it for a little bit. So that's the situation. And then I discovered another thing. I discovered there were brilliant thinkers who were atheists and brilliant thinkers who were Christians like me. And that's very important. Because one of the things that we're told is that if you're rational, you're going to go along with science. Well, you don't believe that in this university, I'm delighted to say. Because if rationality is coextensive with science, you're going to have to shut half your faculties, aren't you? You've got history here, haven't you? Languages, art, all these different things. They're not natural science, but they're rational. And it's very important for us to realize that science and rationality never were and are not coextensive. That is immensely important. But I don't need to tell you that. But let's get back to the natural science. You all know what the Human Genome Project is. Its first director, Jim Watson, Nobel Prize winner. Its second director, the current director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins. I've met both of them and discussed with both of them. Jim Watson, an atheist. Francis Collins, a Christian. Now what does that tell you? It tells you that the issue is not science versus religion. That's what it tells you. The real issue lies deeper. It's a worldview conflict with scientists on both sides. What do I mean by that? Francis Collins, a Christian, he has a theistic worldview. Jim Watson has a naturalistic worldview. Those worldviews are diametrically opposite. But there are scientists on both sides. So in this debate about does rationality take us away from God, we've got to factor this in. Because there is such an impression around the place that it's science versus religion. I would rather you imagine it like this. If we've got a big circle here labeled materialism or naturalism, big circle here labeled theism, in my case Christianity, and a little circle in the middle, science and rationality. And the question then is, with which of the two worldviews does rationality fit best? Does it fit best with materialism and naturalism, or does it fit best with theism? So what evidence can we give? Well, first of all, the fact that science arose in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell later, and so on. All of them believed in God. Now, that is such an obvious fact of history that historians of science, like from Alfred North Whitehead on, have been asking the question, why was that? Was that simply an accident, as Richard Dawkins would say to me? Well, everybody believed in God in those days, so what's big about it? Well, what's interesting about it is this. That Joseph Needham in Oxford, who was a chemist and a sinologist, spoke Chinese, world expert in the history of Chinese technology, and a Marxist. He tried for years to explain the lack of development of science as we know it in China. There was technology, fireworks, printing, lots of things, but nothing that we could call the abstraction which we now know as modern science. And he tried to explain it with Marxist principles, and he gave up. And in the end, he said this. He said, the only explanation I can give for the difference between the West and the East is that the Chinese lack the unifying concept of a creator. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my first major point is this. Quoting C.S. Lewis, and I'm old enough to have heard him lecture in Cambridge, I'll say this. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So my point number one is that far from belief in God hindering the rational development of science, it was the very motor that drove it. And that's one of the major reasons I am not remotely ashamed of being a Christian and a scientist, because Christianity gave me my subject. Now, it's a very curious thing that in the 21st century, we rarely hear about that history. In fact, the very first time I lectured in Siberia, first time in 75 years, the university had opened itself up to a public lecture on why a scientist believes in God. I told them about Newton and Galileo, and there was a row of big burly professors in the front row who looked as if they'd come out of the KGB, and they got really angry. I don't like people being angry, so I stopped, and I said to the professor in the front row, look, excuse me, sir, you look really angry, what's wrong with you? And he stood up and he said, this is the first time in my life I've ever heard that Kepler, Galileo, Newton, and Clerk Maxwell believed in God. Why did they never tell us? I said, can't you guess? But you see, they were angry because they'd never been told. I meet many students today, and they haven't an idea of where science came from. Now, of course, people say, well, that was the infancy stage, and now we've grown out of all of that, and we can forget that. Well, I wonder. Now, if that is so, the next big question is puzzling in a way, and I've thought a great deal about it, is where does this conviction come from that science is rational and belief in God is irrational? So if you're going to be an intellectual or taken seriously, you've got to choose between science and God. Well, it seems to me that there are several problems here. One has to do with a confusion about the nature of science, but the more important one, an initial one, has to do with the confusion about the nature of God. I just come from CERN in Geneva, where the Large Hadron Collider has essentially discovered, with a very high probability, the Higgs boson. You're all aware of that, aren't you? Well, CERN put on a conference, the first time it's ever done it, to discuss, if there are any, what are the theological implications of Big Bang cosmology? So I met some of the principal actors in these experiments and discussed these things with them. Among them was Lawrence Krauss. Now, Lawrence Krauss published an article from ASU in Newsweek just a few weeks ago saying, I quote, "The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God." Well, I'm afraid that provoked me just a little bit. So I replied to it in the London Times, and you can look it up on the web. But I simply said, more important than God for what? The Higgs boson is more important than God if you want to understand particle physics. But is it more important than God if you want to understand why there exists a universe in which particle physics can be done? And what's the point I'm making? It's this. It's that we get confused about the nature of explanation. What is an explanation? I hope you ask yourself that question in the various intellectual disciplines in which you're involved in this college. What constitutes an explanation? And you see, this business of saying choose between science and God, part of the problem comes from false ideas of what we mean by God. I meet many people, of course, in my work, who are leading intellectuals, and they think, I believe in a God of the gaps. Do you know what a God of the gaps is? I can't understand it, therefore God did it. That kind of a God, who's a placeholder, and when science advances or knowledge and rational research advance, God disappears. The kind of idea that people used to believe that lightning was when the gods were angry and thunder. Now we've done a bit of atmospheric physics and the gods disappear. That kind of notion. Now, of course, let's look at the logic of this if it's not too late at night for logic, and I hope it isn't. If you believe in the God of the gaps, of course you've got to choose between science and God, by definition. Because the God of the gaps is there until science fills the gap. So you've got to choose. And that's why Stephen Hawking says exactly the same thing in The Grand Design with Leonard nodding off. Choose between God and science. Because he's thinking that God is a God of the gaps. But I've never met an intelligent theist, Christian, or any other of the great monotheistic faiths who believes in a God of the gaps. God is the God of the whole show. He's the God of the things we don't understand and the God of the things we do. Let me illustrate that. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, marvelous, I understand how it works, I've got a law, therefore I don't need God. What did he do? Well, I hope you know that he wrote the most famous book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, arguing in it, hoping that this would convince people that there is a rational God. In other words, the more he understood, the more he believed in God. You see that? And think of that for a moment. Some of you are doing art. Who understands Rembrandt more, the person who studied painting or the person that hasn't? Who understands, I've just been at the NASCAR Center today, you've probably heard of NASCAR. And looking at those cars, who understands the mechanics of the car better? Those experts who are building it, or me, who doesn't know what a limited slip differential is? Do you see what I mean? It's not the more you understand, the less you believe in God. The more I understand of science, like Newton, the more I admire the genius of the God who did it that way. That is, we're thinking of two different kinds of explanation, and this is so important. It goes right to the root of most of the confusion. I see it. And I find when I go into schools, 12-year-olds can get it. I find some university professors can't, but that's another matter. So let's have a go. Suppose you've heard of a Ford Galaxy. Is that a concept over here? Ford motor car, okay? Sitting there. And its engine is exposed and you can see it. So I say, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to consider seriously two explanations of this. One of them is mechanical engineering and the law of internal combustion. The other is Henry Ford. Please choose. Well, you look at me with amazement and say, but that's absurd. You need both, actually, for a full explanation. But they're different kinds of explanation. Mechanical engineering and the law of internal combustion is a mechanism law explanation, if you like, a scientific explanation. Henry Ford is an agent explanation. And please notice those explanations do not conflict. Now, I'm amazed why certain leading scientists cannot seem to see that. Explanation in terms of science, mechanism, law of the universe doesn't conflict in the slightest with the idea that there's a God who designed and upholds the whole show and created it originally. So once you clear that out of your way, you can see that there are different disciplines and they ask different kinds of questions. But there's just a little bit of a problem in the middle of this. And that is the notion that a scientific explanation is exhaustive. I'm sure many of you read Wittgenstein. If not, I hope you will. Because Wittgenstein it was who said the greatest deception of modernism is that we think the laws of nature are explanations. Newton didn't think that. Do you realize that the law of gravity does not tell us what gravity is? It simply describes what happens. And Newton said non-fingal hypotheses. I do not make hypotheses, by which he meant I've got a law, it's wonderful, but I do not think that I'm explaining to you what the thing is. Nobody knows what gravity is. Nobody knows what energy is. If you don't believe that, read Richard Feynman, one of your greatest physicists. But we can cope with them at a certain level because we've got descriptive laws that tell us about behavior, but they are not explanations in the fullest sense. They're explanations at a certain level. And it's very important to realize that because we've got ourselves into, well, let me illustrate it by a story. It's come story time, I think. I once had a fascinating discussion with Peter Atkins, who's a world-famous professor of physical chemistry in Oxford. I said, Peter, tell me, what created the universe? He said, mathematics. And I started to laugh, and he said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, Peter, I'm sorry, but I am a mathematician, and that's about the silliest thing I've ever heard. 1 + 1 = 2. Has that ever put $2 in your pocket? But you see, this is amazing. This notion that law can create. Now listen to Stephen Hawking. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What? Well, let me try it again. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now I'm coming on to another related question. We started with rationality. Does it lead away from God? I'm going to ask another question. Is science always rational? Well, listen to this. Because there is a law of gravity, that is because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. Contradiction number 1. Number 2. The universe will create itself. I believe you've got a writing course in your first year or so at this college. Well, I'm glad about that. If I say to you X creates Y, what does that mean? The words mean I'm assuming X, the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X creates X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X. And what does that mean? It's nonsense, of course. And nonsense remains nonsense even if it's talked about by the world's most famous scientist. Ladies and gentlemen, this I count as extremely serious. This is irrational. But it's even worse than that. That's 2 levels of contradiction in one sentence. Here comes the third. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe will create itself. He doesn't say because there is gravity. Because there is a law. But what would a law mean in the absence of the thing it purports to describe? And here you get this notion. You find it with Atkins, you find it with Paul Davis, you find it with Stephen Hawking, you find it with many people that laws can create something. But let's take Stephen Hawking's first example of a law. It is the law that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Well, that's a very good law, it's a regularity. But you will notice, of course, that that law didn't create the sun, nor the sky in which it moves. I find this very odd indeed, that people recourse to this kind of thing to avoid certain massive implications. I've written on these things in detail, and you'll find them on my website, johnlennox.org, but it's simply explaining to you, just to give you one or two examples, that science can be extremely irrational. If you like, just another one from Lawrence Krauss. Here it is. He's written a book called A Universe from Nothing, and in it he says this: because something is physical, nothing must be physical. Pardon? Because something is physical, nothing must be physical. But nothing is clearly defined as the absence of anything. I just give that to you as an illustration that sometimes we bow too rapidly to the omniscience, apparently, of scientists. They can talk nonsense as well as the next person. So where does rationality lead? I've given a bit of evidence from history, and I've tried to explain to you that explanation is of different levels. I've only given you two: the mechanism law one, the agency one. And as far as I can see, for many things, both explanations are necessary, but not relevant at every point. Like Krauss says, the Higgs boson is arguably more relevant than God if you're doing particle physics, but not if you're asking the question, why is there a universe in which physics can be done? They're relevant to different questions. And once we see that, we can happily be passionate scientists and also, I believe, passionate believers in God. But there's another problem in this debate, and that is the confusion about the nature of faith. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion, and I debated him in Alabama on that topic. And he thinks that faith, I quote, is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. Scientific belief, and belief's the same word as faith, essentially, according to him, is based upon publicly checkable evidence. Religious faith not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its joy, shouted from the rooftops. Well, not so. At least, let me be careful. I can only speak for Christianity. Other religions have every right and should speak for themselves on this issue. So I'll have to narrow it, because it would take far too long, and I wouldn't be the qualified person to speak on it. This business of faith bedevils the whole discussion, because the new atheists, led by Dawkins, have redefined it for the popular mind, and it's even got into Webster's dictionary. Not yet into the Oxford English Dictionary, but it'll be there in time. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. That's blind faith, ladies and gentlemen. Faith, in the ordinary dictionary sense, comes from the Latin fides, trust, loyalty, commitment. And we all know what it means. Why have you faith? Why do you trust your friends? Why do you trust what your professors tell you, if you do? It's the question of evidence. Of every exercise of faith or belief, we can ask, what is the evidence? If you believe the Red Sox are going to win some great big trophy, whoever the Red Sox are, if you believe they're going to win, somebody will say, well, why do you believe that? What is your evidence? And that is so important, that we do not have this idea that faith is a religious word, and it means simply believing where there's no evidence. Both of those are very dangerously false. Now, there is such a thing as blind faith, and it's very dangerous. It's the kind of thing that causes men to fly jet planes into tall buildings. And I stood on the steps of Columbia University, as you can see in the internet, if you look at Veritas.org, on 9/11 this year, and talked to 700 students about 9/11 and the question of God. That's a different issue, of course. That's blind faith, and it's very dangerous. So we've got to clear up a number of things. One, is the Christian faith blind? Well, its fundamental document is the New Testament. And when it comes to telling us about Jesus, it says this: Jesus did many other things that are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. These things are written in order that you might believe. Here is the evidence upon which faith can be based. So Christianity is an evidence-based faith. I wouldn't stand here for a microsecond if I didn't believe that. So that's the first very important thing to realize. That the claim is, at least, that it is based on evidence. Now, there is a next thing, of course. And the next thing is this. What about science? Does that involve faith? That's an interesting question, isn't it? I had a debate with Peter Singer last September. He's Australian, as many of you know. He's a professor at Princeton. He's the world's leading bioethicist. But he debated me in Melbourne City Hall. And we had a very interesting little conversation near the beginning. I told the audience there what I told you. I was trying to be open and explain that I was prejudiced, my parents were Christian, and so on. And Peter, he said, that's my biggest objection to religious faith, you see, that people normally remain in the faith in which they're brought up. Okay? And I was the prime example, of course, was the obvious implication. So when it came my turn to speak, I said, Peter, I think the audience would be very interested, just so that we can square the thing up a little bit, to know about your parents. Were they atheists? And he said, yes, they were. So I said, so you stayed in the faith in which you were brought up? Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. Now, that little spat is very revealing. Did you see that? Now, this is one of the world's leading philosophers. His belief system is not a faith, mine is. That is staggering to my mind. In fact, a number of atheistic philosophers commented on it subsequently. This idea that a person believes in God is a man of faith, that's actually an insult, because it means Lennox believes where there's no evidence. But if you believe in the materialistic philosophy or naturalism, that's not a faith. Of course it's a faith, it's a belief system. People believe it. Now, where we're getting to is this. We all have a faith, all of us in this room tonight. We all have a worldview. We may not have fully formulated it. Indeed, that's why we're in college, to begin to build up what our fundamental worldview is. What are our answers to these big questions in life? And so you're developing a faith, things you believe, and you'll defend it to other people. But it's very important to see that this is not just a religious phenomenon. And it's even more than that. When you come to science itself, you cannot do science without believing in certain things. Einstein saw this very clearly, but then he was very bright. He said, I can't imagine a scientist without this faith. And what did he mean? He meant faith, belief in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Think about it for a minute. Why would you do science? You've got to start by believing that science can be done. You've got to start by believing that the universe is at least in part accessible to the human mind. In fact, Paul Davis very interestingly says, of the ASU physicist, science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Even most atheistic scientists accepts as an act of faith the existence of law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. So faith is essential to science. Now, that makes it very difficult, you see, for people to enter into this conversation when they're told by people like Richard Dawkins that we have no faith. I mean, Christopher Hitchens was the most marvelous of all. I remember debating him in Alabama. He says, you know, if you have to have faith to believe something, that diminishes the probability that it's true. So I said to him, Christopher, do you believe that you exist? You have faith that you exist? He said, yes. Well, that diminishes the probability that it's true, doesn't it? It's absurd. But again, it's this false definition of faith. And from my point of view, forgive me speaking frankly, it seems to me a very cheap intellectual cop-out to write off faith as believing when there's no evidence and then refusing completely to investigate the evidence when it's presented to you. It disturbs me that Richard Dawkins and many others are constantly asking for evidence, but I see no evidence that they consider the evidence because they don't believe there's any there to be considered. So, faith is not simply a religious concept. It means a commitment based on evidence, and that's true, not simply at the level of faith in a theory, but faith in people. I've been married for 44 years. I trust my wife. Do you think I do it for no reason? Of course not. You've got friends that you trust for no reason. You'd be a fool to trust people for no reason. We have reasons for believing in people. And I mention that believing in people because, ladies and gentlemen, God isn't a theory, He's a person. It's very important to realize that we're not simply talking about theory, so you have to lift up the level of your understanding and realize that evidence for trusting a person is much more comprehensive than evidence that you need to believe in a theory. Now, your title that you gave me really fascinated me. I looked at it and I looked at it and I looked at it because I hadn't had this title before, not quite like this. Does rationality lead away from God? And I thought, you know, that's ambiguous, delightfully ambiguous. Because one possible meaning is, does the use of rationality necessarily lead away from God? But the other much more, well, not much more, but equally interesting thing is this. Rationality itself exists. Does the existence of rationality lead away from God? I want to say the exact opposite, ladies and gentlemen. One of the things that convinces me at the intellectual level, most of all that there is a God, is the existence of rationality. Let me try to explain that to you. When I meet various atheists in the world, I often ask them why they do science and why they believe that the instrument they use to do the science, that is the human mind, can be trusted. I'm of course referring to the famous Darwin's doubt. Darwin wrote this, "With me the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy." Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? This is Charles Darwin, by the way, working out the logical implications of his own theories. Now, let's have a look at that. Because Darwin's doubt has now become the focus of a number of very high-powered philosophical studies because of its sheer importance as to the nature and reliability of human cognition. Let me explain this to you as simply as possible. And crudely in a way, but you get the point, I think. Here I am, I'm a scientist, I'm doing science with the mind. What is the mind? Gosh, you say, you're not going to raise the mind-body problem at this time of night. I am, but I'm not going to answer it. Well, the materialist, of course, is obliged to say the mind is the brain. So what's the brain? Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process that has produced the brain, consciousness, and everything else without any external input, because this universe is a closed system, from the simplest of chemicals on the Earth's surface. Now, tomorrow morning, each of you will open a computer, I suspect, early in the morning. If you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? course you will. Now here's the interesting thing. I started with the genetic fallacy. You say that because you're Irish. Now let's deepen that and heighten it and think of what's going on. There's the mind, it equals the brain. Where does the brain come from? Well, it's explained exhaustively in terms of psychology, which is explained exhaustively in terms of biochemistry, which is explained exhaustively in terms of chemistry, which is explained exhaustively in terms of physics, which is reduced. But if you follow the genetic fallacy, that is to empty it of all meaning. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons I believe in God at the level of my science and rationality is this, that as far as I can see, atheism undermines the trust in rationality I need to do my science. It's not a theological argument. And it's been pointed out by a number of philosophers, most notably Thomas Nagel in the book he published last week called Mind and Cosmos. And he comes on the side of this argument, saying Darwin's doubt, this kind of thing, it is weakening, seriously weakening the very confidence we need to do science. And of course, many people saw it long ago. C.S. Lewis saw it brilliantly long ago. And so did J.B.S. Haldane, a brilliant chemist. He said, look, if the thoughts in my mind are simply the motions of elementary particles in my brain, why should I believe in elementary particles or any of the thoughts they produce? Where will you get a rational justification for trusting your mind to do science? Now, of course, some people say you don't need it. Well, that's very interesting for people that insist on getting rational justification for everything else. So what I'm arguing here is there is a blind faith that lies at the heart of atheism at this level. It's the jump, the leap in the dark to trust reason, even though you have no rational justification for doing so. Now, why do I trust my mind to a certain extent? Well, the Christian explanation is that ultimately, whatever mechanisms are involved, the universe was created by an intelligent God, and so was the human mind. And so the one has access to the other. That makes a great deal of logical sense to me. So, to sum this up then, because I'm going to stop in a minute and allow you time for questions. I promised to try to keep it to 50 minutes, and I'd like to keep to that. I find it very interesting indeed. The ideas that are coming up now and being developed very articulately by people like Alvin Plantinga, who's a world-famous philosopher just retired from Notre Dame, that this Darwin's doubt needs to be taken very seriously. I see no answer to it within atheism. I do see a very clear answer to it within Christianity. But because it's so important, I want to finish it and explain it from another perspective by telling you a final story. I am a fellow, as you heard, of Green Templeton College, which is a delightful graduate college with about 500 graduate students. And we have dinners every Thursday night, and they're candlelit and they're absolutely delightful. But the one problem is that you've got to sit where you're put. So this night I found myself sitting beside someone I didn't know. And he turned out to be a very eminent professor of biochemistry who led one of the big units and is world famous. So as is usual in the Oxford environment, he said to me, and what do you do? I said, pure mathematics. Oh dear, he said, how boring. Well, that wasn't a very good start because I could see he meant it. So I tried again and I said, oh well, yes, I realise that my subject is not all that sociable. So I tried to make up for it by being interested in the really big questions of life. He said, like what? Well, I said, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? The status of life. Is it made in the image of God or not? Oh dear, he said, it's far worse than I thought. Listen, he said, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've got nothing to talk about, we're going to have an absolutely miserable evening. Well, that's a great start to dinner, you know. So, I looked at him and I smiled and I said, no, I don't think so. He said, why not? Well, I said, you know, I'm fascinated by reductionism. I really am. He said, are you? I said, yeah. I said, there are at least 3 kinds. Oh, he said, are there? Yes, I said, there are. There's methodological, And I said, I think we agree on that. Take a big problem, split it into little problems, solve the little problems, get insight into the big problem. Yeah, he said, that's why we work in the lab. Well, I said, there we are. We could talk about something, can't we? Well, they said, I suppose we can. But I said, I think you're an ontological reductionist. That is, you believe that ultimately explanation goes inevitably in one direction, from the simple to the complex, from elementary particles to consciousness. In other words, you can reduce everything to physics and chemistry. He said, that's exactly what I believe. So I said, let's do an experiment then. He said, what, are you at dinner? I said, yeah, sure. Why not? Let's do an experiment. So he said, with what? I said, with this. And I picked up the menu. And it said roast chicken. It wasn't even in French. It wasn't very imaginative for an Oxford college, but never mind. It said roast chicken. So he said, what's interesting about that? Well, I said, look at it. R-O-A-S-T. Those are marks on paper. Yes, he said. But I said they're more than that. They've got a semiotic dimension. Semeion, Greek sign, they carry meaning. I said, you're a reductionist. He said, yes. So I said, explain to me the semiotics of those letters in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was silence. And his wife was sitting next to him. And she said rather too loudly, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. He said something I shall never forget. It was stunning. He said, you know, John, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory in Oxford thinking that could be done. 40 years. And he said, now I see it come. I was so staggered by his response that I backtracked and played devil's advocate. We Irish are good at that. And I said, but physics and chemistry have only been going 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You cannot account for the semiotics without the input of an intelligence. Oh, I said, really? And then it dawned on him that I wasn't clever enough to have thought of the argument. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, from a Nobel Prize winner. I always said, that's a relief. But ladies and gentlemen, just let me take it a step further. I believe you have lovely beaches on the coast of North Carolina. You go down to the beach and you see the letters of your name in the sand. What do you infer? Instantly, no matter how many automatic processes may have been involved in putting those letters there, you say there's intelligence behind this. Okay? Just half a dozen letters, 10 maybe. And now you go into the laboratory. And let's do a bit of magic now. And imagine there's such a thing as a stereoscopic microscope. That when you put a cell underneath it, it splits up the DNA so that you can read the codons. CCGATTGCATTT. It's a magic microscope. They haven't got one like that. 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order, like a computer program. With all the language of information, theoretical computer science at our hands to describe. And I ask you, and where did that come from? Oh, chance and necessity. What? You mean chance and the laws of nature? Yes. But half a minute, you saw 10 letters on the sand and you said intelligence. There's something odd going on, ladies and gentlemen. Because we human beings, and every one of the 10 trillion cells in our body, have got the longest word that's ever been discovered. The significance of that is overwhelming, because it raises a question as to the origin of digital information. Of course there have been processes, physical and chemical involved, but it's a code. It's got a semiotic dimension. It codes for protein. Now let me close with this. I started with 2 worldviews. I finish with the 2 expressed slightly differently. The first worldview starts in the beginning with mass energy. And mass energy produced galaxies It produced, before the galaxies, various kinds of elements. They condensed into galaxies. We got stars and we got planets. And eventually, it produced life by the unguided permutations of the inherent potentiality subject to the laws of nature. That's one story. The other is this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to exist through Him. And without Him, nothing came to exist that came to exist. Now you see the two worldviews. One starts with mass energy, and mind is derivative. The other starts with mind, and mass energy is derivative. And both as a scientist and a Christian, I think the evidence is overwhelming for the one that starts in the beginning was the Word. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now we've got the opportunity to hear your questions. And those of you who know me or have seen me on the internet know that I have a certain way of answering questions. Because in a room like this, there are many questions. And both I am interested and you're interested in hearing what other people's questions are. So what I'm going to do is collect a number of questions before I approach any of them, just till we see the range of ideas that's buzzing around in your head. So it's not the time for a speech. It's just the time to ask a question. I will write it down, and put up your hand if you have one. I recognize you, I write it down, and when we feel we've got enough, I'll have a look at them. So off we go. And someone will bring the mic to you. Just keep putting up your hands. One. Okay, pass the mic over. Or else, would it be easier for folks to come up and just go to a mic? I don't mind what they do. Okay, off you go. One.
Do you think that your argument kind of reduces to the prime mover argument? And do you think the prime mover argument is still compelling if time doesn't exist or isn't anything but an illusion?
Okay. Is it compelling if time doesn't exist? Does that give me license to stay as long a time as I Okay, number two.
You were mentioning that the scientists are using a faulty premise at the core of their theories about the beginning of the universe. And I'm just curious why, do you think these scientists are all basing their theories off of just a wrong idea? They can't understand a logical fallacy? Or,
well, can you tell me what the faulty idea is?
The faulty idea you mentioned is X from X. You referred to the X from X being a faulty theory? And I'm just curious if there's these high-level scientists saying...
Oh, the X creates X?
Yes.
Oh, okay, right, okay. Next. 3.
Hi, my question is, do you think that theism, as opposed to the existence of God, is too big for your Henry Ford analogy? For instance, one couldn't pray to Henry Ford to repair their car, if you will. If you could just expand on that.
Four.
My question is, how would you explain Jesus Christ being the only way, and I guess do you believe it's the only way to God?
Thank you. Thank you very much. 5.
I noticed that you invoked Paley's watchmaker at the end, and you were also talking about the difficulty of where consciousness comes in. And I was wondering if you considered that a sort of God of the gaps approach that you mentioned at the beginning, because we can't explain this thus far without intelligence, and we can't see where intelligence comes in these systems. And also I remember reading that there was some engineer somewhere out in California created neural networks in computers that have given them the ability to learn, and have also studied logic gates in the brain, and I wondered if perhaps you could speak to us about that.
Thank you. 6. You can see, ladies and gentlemen, my technique is brilliant. I just keep collecting the question when the time's up, I run. Yes, please.
I have a question about the approach you took instead of what you actually said. So as a follower of Christ, what you said is like milk and honey in my ears, and I'm sure it was to a lot of people who believe in God. But what would you say are the strengths and the limitations of using reason in dialogues with quote-unquote people of reason?
Thank you. Right, 7's a perfect number. Will we get to 7? And then we'll draw a line and we'll see how we get on with those.
So you find it very unconvincing that life could have arisen out of anything but from an intelligent designer. It could have.
Sorry, I just slowed down a little bit.
Sorry. Alright, so you find it unconvincing that life could have arisen from anything but an intelligent designer.
Do I find it unconvincing?
Yes, you do. And so I'm so excited.
It's nice when people answer the questions they've asked. So, what's your question?
My question is, so to quote Lord Chakasi, to paraphrase him, he said, the universe is a massive, massive place, which I'm sure you accept. So
the universe is a
massive, massive place.
Yeah.
And so rare things happen all the time, including life.
Oh.
So if you believe that if there is other life out there in the massive universe, did God reveal himself to them as well? And could they be Christians in the same way that they are here if there is only one ultimate God?
Okay, right. We'll have to stop there just for a moment. So let's have a look at some of these. The first question, I'm not going to answer these in any special order, just the way they collect in my mind as I think about them now. Do you think your argument refers to a prime mover, and is it compelling? Very little of my argument has to do with a prime mover, just a little bit of it. In the simple sense that when we see something in existence, we immediately ask what caused it. Now, there's a fascinating current history to this, because when I was a student at Cambridge, the first evidence started to come in for the hot Big Bang, and it was resisted fiercely by the scientific establishment. The reason it was resisted was fascinating. John Lennox, who was at the time the editor of Nature, said we can't go down this road because it gives too much leverage to people who believe in creation. So the interesting thing was the Aristotle's steady-state universe, which had dominated European thought for centuries. Any questioning of that was resisted because it corresponded too closely with Genesis. And of course that was overcome by sheer force of the scientific evidence. Now, the interesting thing is that left people with a singularity in this universe. And that singularity has proved to be an immense embarrassment to certain people. They admit it. This isn't me. Hawking says it. It smacks too much of a creation. So there are various devices. The development of the theory is fascinating because first of all there's a move to get rid of the singularity by invoking something called imaginary time, but it doesn't work in real time. So people are now almost compelled to believe in the singularity. I was at MIT and Harvard recently, and in the faculty club I had a public debate or discussion with Alan Guth, the father of inflation theory, one of the most distinguished cosmologists in the world. And we were talking about these things. Now the interesting thing about Alan Guth, that he with another distinguished astrophysicist, Alex Vilinkin, and another man called Board, have proved a theorem which says that even if you go for a multiverse, if you don't know what that is, go to bed happy. Even if you go for a multiverse, it still is true that it's past incomplete. In other words, there is a beginning. And Vilenkin says cosmologists can no longer escape in the idea there wasn't a beginning of some kind. So we're left with a singularity. So now the pressure is on to do something different, and that is this. That is to try to explain how the universe comes from nothing. Because if there is a singularity, and if there is something, we're now back at Leibniz's big question, why is there something rather than nothing? And hence Hawking and Mladinov, hence Lawrence Krauss's recent book, Creation of a World from Nothing, and so on and so forth. So your question about do you think the prime mover argument is substantial? I do think it's very substantial because people are fighting against it tooth and nail at the moment. And it's there where I come into this other business where X creates X. And I see it as a kind of desperation, I must say so, and I would say to the scientists involved, because to use illogical language is not going to help anybody. Christ talks a lot about the definition of nothing. And there's no unclarity about the definition of nothing. If I say I've been down the street and I met nobody, it doesn't mean I've been down the street and I met somebody who was nobody. It means I didn't meet anybody. Have you got that? And similarly, with this definition of nothing, now because there's so much confusion, because Krauss claims you get the universe from absolutely nothing. Alan Guth is the top man in the world in this. So I decided to ask him publicly. I said, Alan, look, many people are confused on this topic of nothing, the universe coming from nothing. You don't mean nothing in the normal philosophical sense, absence of being. You call it a false vacuum, a quantum vacuum, and so on. He said, no, we don't mean nothing. And I find that very honest and helpful. They haven't solved the problem they claim to have solved. So all I would say is, I think it is one argument, but many atheists think it is the most important argument to attack at the moment. And we don't get anywhere by using language like the universe creates itself. That is just nonsense. Now, the next thing was, do you think that theism is too big for your Henry Ford analogy? No, not for what I intended the analogy for. It's too big for what you intended it for, which is a different point. And you rightly make the point you can't pray to Henry Ford, not even if you want a new car. It's very important to realize, and I'm sure you're taught this in literature, that analogies and metaphors, you mustn't try to draw all the conceivable consequences out of them. What is my point in using Henry Ford? It's when we're thinking of explaining a motor car engine. There are the two sides. There's agency, Henry Ford, and there's mechanism and law. That's all I was trying to explain. I'm not saying God is like Henry Ford. I'm simply saying in explanation at the ordinary human level we learn to distinguish these two things. Why on earth can't we learn to distinguish them at the higher levels? That's the only point I'm making. So it's just simply a question of the way we use metaphors, analogies, and language. Now, another question was, this earth is a massive place, and the man who answered his own question and asked me another one. This earth is a massive place, and life just happens. Well, I don't think it does just happen. And I don't meet anybody these days, atheists, that think it's random. They think that various selection processes involve a law like this that solves the problem. I don't believe that, but I haven't time to go into it tonight. I've written a book on it called God's Undertaker, Science Buried God. But the point you make is other life in the universe. Well, I had a very interesting radio debate, it's still there online, with Paul Davis of the ASU, who is the director of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I had a debate with him, and they were asking him what he really thought about it. And I thought Paul was very open. Paul used to be an examiner in the university I taught at years ago, so I know him a little bit, and we had a very friendly debate. But he really says, look, if I wear my sort of human hat, philosopher's hat, I'd love to think there's extraterrestrial life out there. But as a scientist, I'm doubting it more and more. Now, whether there is or not, it doesn't disturb my faith in the slightest for two reasons. One is, I take my stand, of course, on the Bible. The Bible is rustling, its pages rustle with the idea that this ain't the only one there is anyway. The Bible, of course, doesn't tell us everything about the universe. It tells us what we need to know. And when I was asked, did I believe that if there was life out there, I said, yes, one very big one called God. Now, of course, that was being slightly facetious. But you see what I mean. This universe as we know it, or the multiverse we've come to think of as a closed system of cause and effect, that is the big assumption. That's part of the faith of materialism. I don't believe it's true. I think it's an open system. And I think, therefore, that God can do things in it just as much as he upholds it. And that could lead us into another big realm of questions that nobody asked, so I'm not going to answer them. How can you as a scientist believe in this supernatural? But if you want to follow that, because it's such an important question, David Hume, the Enlightenment, you do all this in philosophy. I have just written another book looking at these things through the eyes of David Hume, because I think it's enormously important. And in particular, I have subjected the resurrection of Jesus, which is the central claim of the Christian faith as evidence, to the criteria that Hume lays down for witnesses, and also subjected his views of miracles to a pretty serious analysis in this direction. So that's life in the rest of the universe. Now, another question was, I mentioned Paley's watchmaker. I didn't actually, but I think what you mean is I mentioned that kind of an argument. That is the inference of intelligence. And you say, isn't this God of the gaps again? Now, your question is immensely important. And I take it very seriously, because no scientist likes to be accused of believing in a God of the gaps. And in my writings on it, I distinguish two kinds of gap. The bad gaps are the gaps that science closes. Lightning is the gods. No, it isn't. It's a discharge, it's electricity, it's air pressure, and all the rest of it. But now, it seems to me there are good gaps that science opens. In 1953, when Miller and Urey did the experiment for which they got the Nobel Prize, thinking they discovered what life was. That's a long time ago. There has been no real advance, because now we know the digital nature of DNA. Now, in science, we've got two kinds of science, really. Inductive and abductive. The inductive science is where you can repeat the experiment and see what happened. Lots of things you can't do that. You cannot repeat the history of life, you cannot repeat the history of the universe. And so scientists go to what they call abductive inference, or inference to the best explanation. It's the kind of thing Hercule Poirot uses, or Inspector Morse. Do you all know Inspector Morse at Oxford? If you don't, you're missing a treat. But anyway, you can't. Here lies the body of Lennox on the floor. Oh, well, we can solve this mystery. Let's just rerun it and see what happened. That's absurd. So you have to use inference to the best explanation. Now, here I'm coming to your point. We're faced with what we recognize as digital information. We're faced with sources that can produce it, that is intelligent input. And we're faced with sources, and now comes the question, that cannot produce it. And you say, but be very careful, because saying that natural processes cannot produce information is trying to prove a negative, and that's impossible. I would just pause there carefully, because I happen to be a mathematician, and we're a luxury subject, you know. For this reason, people put up conjectures. You can price out an angle by means of a straight edge and compasses, and they try for 1,000 years or so to do it. They don't. They fail. So then they decide to try to prove it cannot be done. And they, of course, have established that. It's great fun to teach it in an undergraduate course. So mathematics is one of those areas where you can get proofs running in two directions. Now, you don't get that very often in natural science. You get it, well, one area, of course, is the perpetual motion machine. I used to get long papers in the post. Dear Professor Lennox, I have solved the problem. Here is a description of a perpetual motion machine. Hundreds of equations and so on. What did I do? Straight in the waste paper basket. If you said to me, but that's being obscurantist, how do you know they haven't done it? I'll say, well, actually, the reason is because I believe in the law of conservation of energy. And if you investigate that, you'll discover that there's a flaw in it. Okay? Most scientists take my view of this. Now, raise that up a dimension. Information is a very interesting concept. It's a very difficult concept. And I think theoretical computer science can help us here, because there's a lot of work been done, although it's immensely difficult. And it's not completely conclusive, but it is very suggestive. One very suggestive statement is junk in, junk out. You've heard that one before. And making that in a more sophisticated way, Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, asked, is there such a thing as a law of conservation of information? One interpretation of which would mean something like natural processes can transmit information, but they cannot generate it. And he says, to this day, I know of no counterexample. Now, people are working on this. And it resonates with work done by people like Leonard Brewery and so on in computer science. That is the idea that natural processes, let me put it in one example, that a Turing machine is an abstract computer that will simulate any computer known or unknown. And there's a brilliant mathematician in the United States, works for Bell Labs, called Gregory Zeitlin. And his argument, as far as I can remember at this late hour of night, but it's in my book if you want to look, is that a Turing machine cannot generate any information that's not either in its input or in its own informational system. Now that is a very powerful indicator, not a proof yet, but an indicator that the search for the origin of life without intelligence is doomed to destruction. Do it by all means, as hard as you like, but it seems to me the indicators are coming that intelligence, which is the natural understanding of it, is much more likely. Now, here's the bottom line for me. I would prefer to believe an explanation that makes sense than one that makes no sense at all. And that is why I do not think it's a God of the gaps. You see, I was very tempted when the man, remember the menu story? And when he said you need an intelligence, I was very tempted, but I didn't do it because I'm far too polite. I really said to him, you mean an intelligence of the gaps, don't you? The point being that it's the nature of what you're studying that demands intelligence, and he could see that. That isn't an intelligence of the gaps. Your inference from the letters of your name on the beach that there's intelligence is not an inference of gaps. It's an inference to the best explanation that you know. So that is the way I would approach that. Now, I promised to finish around 9 o'clock, and I'm going to do that. 2 questions left. One is, what are the strengths and limitations of using reason? I suspect what's behind this question is the perceived conflict that many people have, particularly Christians, that reason and revelation are opposed. And many new atheists think the same. You see, we don't believe in holy books, we believe in reason. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can't even read a holy book without using your reason. So point number 1, it is absurd to think, even if there is a God, and I believe there is one, that revelation, like the Bible, shuts off your reason. Think about it. If you want to get to know me, you could put me under a scanning, tunneling microscope of the most sophisticated kind, and you could measure my brain waves if I've got any and all the rest of it. You'll never get to know me, unless I reveal myself to you. Now, how do I reveal myself to you? By talking to you. Now, when I start revealing myself to you, do you shut off your mind? Of course not. You engage it to understand what I'm saying. It's exactly the same. You see, revelation, in the sense in which I believe that Scripture is the Word of God and God is revealing Himself to us, Doesn't surprise me that that's true, incidentally. If there is a God that created the atom and the human mind, it's not surprising he might want to reveal himself to us. But leaving that aside and just thinking of the concept, revelation and reason are not in the same category. We use reason on the universe. It is a source of information. We use reason on the Bible. It is a source of information. We use reason in both directions. So when you say is reason limited, not in that sense, but I understand what you mean, and there's a related problem. And that is the suspicion that I'm trusting my reason. I would want to say, I hope not, that I'm such an imperfect man that I'm sure I do trust my reason at times. But what I'd like to think is this, that what I'm doing is trusting God and using my reason. Because trusting my reason and using God is what I might call idolatry. There's a very fine line between the two. And once we clear that up, we can realize that the Apostle Paul went round and reasoned everywhere. We use words. God uses words. He reasoned. Come, let us reason together, says the Lord. Reason is a wonderful thing. And it would be a very dangerous thing to believe in God without reason, wouldn't it? So that's how I respond to that. The final question came from over there. Sorry to keep you waiting for so long. Is Jesus the only way? You know, I have friends in all religions and none, and I often get asked this question. First thing we need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, is to separate two things. And that is people's ethical behavior from their religious beliefs. Because as you look around the religions and philosophies of the world, you will find a very remarkable thing. That there is a common core of fundamental morality. Belief in truth and honesty and respect for the old. You can read about this almost anywhere. Dawkins admits it. For me, that is evidence that we are all moral beings created in the image of God, for what it's worth. And when I'm asked this question, I go very carefully, because when I differ with some of my friends, my Muslim friends and my Jewish friends in particular, my Hindu friends, I do it with a great deal of respect, because sometimes our friends who come from other religions and philosophies can actually put us to shame. It even occurs in the Bible where pagan people put professing believers to shame. So the only way I can answer the question is on the basis of evidence. Now, let's take the three great monotheistic religions, because we haven't time to do any more than that. Judaism believes that Jesus died and did not rise. Islam believes he didn't die. Christianity believes he both died and rose again. You historians and you who are not historians can see those are three incompatible historical positions. So how do we face it? Because the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead, and that is evidence that he is God incarnate. And I suggest the only way we can do it is the way we do it with anything in history, is have a look at the evidence, which is why, forgive me for mentioning it again, I spent so much time in my recent book, Gunning for God, going through the evidence. And I started there in Cambridge. I remember listening spellbound to one of the most distinguished lawyers in the world conducting a forensic examination of the evidence for the resurrection. But you say it didn't happen recently. No, it didn't, but with 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. And Luke, for instance, has been proved to be one of the greatest historians in antiquity, and so on and so forth. I haven't time to go into that evidence, but you can see that I at least believe it to be substantial. That won't convince you, nor should it. You've got to read it for yourself and study. But I'm coming to the point. The reason I trust Christ and I'm a Christian is firstly because I believe the evidence is there, but there's another reason. It's to do with evidence, but of a slightly different kind. Let me put it this way, ladies and gentlemen. Often people get the impression that religions compete with one another. But Jesus competes with nobody. That ought to be obvious. Because he offers me something that nobody else offers me. If you investigate religions and philosophies, you find, very crudely speaking, that all of them have a gate at the beginning, a prescribed way that you stay on, and a gate at the end, a judgment assessment, letting you into heaven or whatever it is. It's like Davidson College. You recognize it, don't you? You've got to get certain grades to get in, I tell you. But when you get in and you've got all these lovely professors helping you, they can't guarantee that you're going to come out at the end. You've got to face examinations, I believe. Certainly we do. So, many people, and they've told me this themselves, in many religions say it is exactly like that. There's some sort of ceremony at the beginning that gets you in, and you've got the various doctors of the particular religion and the teachers that will prescribe the way, but in the end, the whole thing depends on your merit, so they cannot tell you that you're going to get through at the end. Many people think that Christianity is like that, but it isn't, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't. Because relationships are not like that. This deep-seated idea that acceptance with God is gained by merit is something we would never insult a human being with. Let me illustrate that to you. Suppose I did, first day at Cambridge, I saw a beautiful girl. She was only 16. Should I have told you that? Probably not. But anyway, suppose I'd come to her a few years later and said, Sally, I'd love you to be my wife. But of course I couldn't accept you now. I mean, here's a cookbook. It's got lots of laws. Thou shalt cook an apple cake in the following manner. Thou shalt take so much flour, thou shalt take so much sugar, and so on and so forth. Now, if you keep those laws pretty well for the next 20 or 30 years, then I would think of accepting you. How would you think of that for a marriage contract? You ladies would be insulted, wouldn't you? And yet millions of people think exactly like that. About God. God, if I try my best and perhaps you'll accept me sometime. That's exactly the same kind of thinking. Because ingrained in the human psyche is that salvation, acceptance with God, is on the basis of human merit. The glorious reason why I'm a Christian is that that's impossible, and God knows it is, and has provided a salvation that's big enough. And that's where the death of Christ comes in. I was talking about his resurrection, but if he rose, it raises the question, why did he die? And the reason he died is to effect a basis on which God can accept me now. I'm certain of my relationship with God, ladies and gentlemen, my forgiveness. And that one day I'll be with God in heaven, not because of my merit, but because of what he's done for me. And that liberates you. We started with your motto, learning in liberty. The greatest liberty is to learn that you can start life by knowing that God has forgiven you and given you peace with him and given you a new life and given you power for living. And you can live and serve God with all your intellectual pursuits and all the other pursuits, not in order to gain acceptance, but because you've already got it. And my wife, she loves me. Why? I scarcely know, but she does. And because she loves me, she seeks to cook nice apple cake for me. But if she turns it accidentally up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit that burns it to a cinder, she doesn't think I'm going to send her back to her mother. The thing that sets her free to cook is because she knows my love for her is independent of her performance. It's where marriages go wrong, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? But that's another topic. A very big and important topic. And I close with this magnificent thing. Jesus doesn't compete with anybody. because only he offers us this. I find it nowhere else, in no other religion or no other philosophy. Much as I admire the way in which so many people live their lives. But I know as a human being, and I am being very honest with you, you don't expect this of an Oxford professor. I know that there is a God and I'm ultimately going to have to meet him. On what basis is the big question. And that's exactly where Christianity becomes the magnificent answer. Thank you very much indeed.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.